Thank you very much, Stu. And once again, good morning, everyone. It's really so wonderful to be able to have this session, to get to see so many old friends, even in this very difficult time and across really an ocean still. It's really a delight, and I would like to thank Stu for the invitation, and indeed the entire Kahal for making yet another exciting, interesting, hopefully successful collaborative venture between the Adat and the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies possible. And Jennifer, thank you very much to you as well as always for working your magic and coordinating with Stu, making sure that we at least got to this stage. Now, if things fall from here, the onus is on me, but at least we got to this stage, and that is truly, truly wonderful. What I would like to do today, we advertised this talk, this session, to be about Israel's battle, Israel's dealing with combating the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been with us in the world, with Israel, with Canada, for a long time, much longer than we would have thought, much longer than policymakers would have thought. And it will be with us for quite some more time ahead in the future. There is a lot to say, even for a political scientist myself. With full disclosure, I am not a public health professional. I am not a medical scientist. So I will be looking at how Israel has been weathering the challenges of COVID-19 through the prism of a social scientist, through the prism of a political scientist. And I would like to try to share some interesting and important insights and findings with you about what is striking about some of the particularities of what COVID-19 presented and challenged Israel with. So what I would like to do today, as a general, so just want to give you a sense of the plan for the next, I think maybe about half an hour to 40 minutes. It really depends on how much I can test your patience to bear with me, but also on how interesting you find the topic. So we'll see how far we go. But the three main topics that I would like to hit on. First, I would like to share with you a general sense of the numbers and the data about COVID-19 in Israel from about March of this year. That's really the moment when the pandemic really became an issue in Israel. There was a mission, one of the shuls from Montreal actually still had a mission in Israel just as the third elections in that series of 3 elections that we all read and talked so much about was concluding, and thereafter, of course, travel was suspended. So from that moment on, we can really talk about the pandemic situation in earnest in Israel. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the data and also some of the changes in which Israel has weathered and dealt with those changing numbers in terms of the fatalities, in terms of the changing rates of morbidity, and the general sense of flattening the curve. And we look at what that actually meant in the case of Israel. The second main point, what I would like to discuss, and I'll give you a sense in a moment why I think that's important to talk about, are some of the particular societal and some of the particular political challenges that COVID-19 presented the country with. And here it's going to be very important to actually circle back to where Israel was socially and politically at the time when COVID hit. And it's going to be very important to remember that that third election that was taking place in the country in March 2020 was a third in a series of elections, indicating and marking a general political and social malaise, polarization in the country, deep divisions that were indeed so deep that they almost, the political class almost found it impossible to surmount these divisions. People were talking about yet a fourth election coming. Eventually it didn't happen, and in May 2020, eventually a so-called national unity / national emergency coalition government was formed. Now, part of the reason and part of the problem I'm going to stress in the second part of the talk is that this government looked much more like an emergency government and much less like a national unity government. There has been a lot more disunity to this government than not. And that is a very important and very big part of the problem that compounded the public health aspect and the public health challenge of the virus and COVID-19. And then there is another particular societal aspect that I want to highlight, and that is the issue of two sectors in Israel, and these are the Arab and the Haredi communities, which have been particularly hard hit by COVID-19 for various reasons that have to do with their lifestyle, with their traditional way of being, and I'll share some of the insights and some of the reports that scholars and both public health scholars as well as social scientists who survey the communities and Israeli attitudes to these problems have found. And third, I'm going to, and in the third part of the talk, I would like to ask the question, okay, so where are we heading? Where is Israel heading? As we get closer to late December, December 23rd is going to be yet another, the second in a series of cutoffs where an immediate coalition collapse might be triggered. And I will talk a little bit more about this. There is no agreement on the new budget or on having a budget for this year. So it's an old new budget, an alt-neu budget, if you would like. If there is no old new budget, then that's going to set in motion an automatic election trigger. And as Israelis, as pundits and politicians start talking more and more about this, we also have to raise the question of, okay, who stands to benefit from this instability, from this political uncertainty in the context of this tremendous public health challenge that the country is facing. So in the third part of the talk, I would like to look into a crystal ball with you. And of course, that will allow us to also reason backward, right? So in order, if we see who has been standing to gain more or less, if elections were to follow now, that actually gives us some clues in terms of why certain decisions were made and why certain decisions were not made about the pandemic. So, and perhaps we can tease that and open that up a little bit more in the Q&A. So with your permission, I'm going to share with you a couple of slides, but I'll make sure that I'm not going to be just showing the slides because then we lose touch with each other, but I'll try to come in and out, back and forth. So let me start with the first part of the talk, and that's really the nature of COVID and the nature of this particular pandemic and why it really challenges Israel, but any society in particular ways. It's a new virus. It is a virus that didn't have and still doesn't have a known antidote, if you will. That's why the race for the vaccine that we know Israel is now signing, or actually has made an agreement for the first big shipment of the vaccine when eventually it's rolled out, and really it's now imminent. But until now, this really wasn't, there was nothing of the sort available, which meant that states, governments, and societies had to play a very delicate and coordinated dance together in order to battle the pandemic crisis. For weeks, for months, eventually for almost now well over half a year on end. Why? States could introduce restrictive measures about lockdowns, about closures, and Israel had already two major episodes of lockdowns with tremendous economic costs and economic pains associated with them. These are nothing new. These are also familiar to us very much from the Montreal, from the Canadian context as well. But then you also need the voluntary compliance of society. People can obey, and if the fines are harsh enough, although in the Israeli case, we do see that even very, very heavy fines do not constitute a substantial enough and a sufficiently strong deterrent for people to necessarily obey what the government wants them to do during these periods of restricted mobility. But to make sure that society is able to withstand the COVID pandemic's damage, society also needs to do its part. That's why the concept of social distancing social distancing cannot really be so effectively enforced. It needs to be managed and acquiesced and handled by society. So we really have a situation where governments, sort of coercion, and the state and society, the voluntary sphere of our life, they have to work together. And that kind of coordination requires a tremendous amount of trust, both ways. And this is why Israel was caught in at such a difficult moment in the spring of 2020 when COVID came. Because COVID hit the country at the time when its political class and its overall social, its society were suffering with a tremendous decline of precisely that trust, social cohesion, and social capital. And this is not unique to Israel, but the deep decline in political trust was something that we really didn't see in many countries, certainly in the Western world. Now, let me just share the screen with you for a moment. And I hope you should be able to see now this chart, and I hope you all can. Unless somebody tells me that no, Csaba, what you're talking about has nothing to do with the screen, I'm going to come back and try another button. But what you should see here is a comparative graphic of the data about the cumulative number of cases, so over time in Israel and Switzerland. Now, the Israeli, and you see the legend, Israel is indicated by the purple dotted line. It actually looks like more like solid. And the blue dotted line indicates that of Switzerland. The numbers I simply retrieved from the official data collected by the WHO, an important international organization that, of course, received a lot of flack for its alleged missed opportunities and mishandling of the crisis early on, certainly when it came to reporting the COVID pandemic in a timely manner from China. But when it comes to cross-national, international data collection of this sort, it's really the organization whose data seems to be the most comprehensive. So I felt comfortable enough to share this with you. Along the horizontal dimension, you see the timeline, essentially bringing us, you start seeing that the actual numbers are being reported here in March, and this is where we are now in November of 2020. Now, why am I comparing Israel with Switzerland? Well, first of all, it's important to note that the WHO is classifying Israel in terms of public health data in the group of European states. So, so those are the natural comparators for us to draw meaningful comparisons with. When it comes to Western Europe, which obviously because of the countries, because of Israel's level of socioeconomic development, is a more natural comparison to make than Eastern Europe would be. Switzerland is really the one with pretty much the same size of the same population size. So it makes sense to compare how very advanced societies of the similar population size have been managing or have faced and witnessed whether the COVID-19 pandemic. Now you'll see that from March of 2020 until about July of 2020, so until this period right here, we see that Israel actually did quite a bit better than Switzerland. The Israeli line, in terms of the cumulative number of cases, remained consistently below that of Switzerland. It is as we start getting closer to the end of the summer, and of course, once we start entering the period of the Jewish high holidays, the Hagim, things are really getting out of control. Throughout the summer, of course, the government of Israel started relaxing the previously imposed travel restrictions, which many other, certainly European countries also did. So not surprisingly, or at least partly as a result of that, we start seeing changes in the numbers. Now, if you just harken back for a moment or if you just wanted to come out of the share screen for a moment, but if you think back of where the charts are today, of course, it's a very different story. Israel today significantly surpassed the numbers from Switzerland, with a cumulative number of cases now significantly over 300,000, and with the death rate also well exceeding now 2,000, which of course in the Israeli psyche and public discourse also created very interesting and powerful and painful associations, depending on the newspapers and the news outlets that you read, with the casualties and the losses that the country suffered in the Yom Kippur War, the anniversary of which of course was recently commemorated. Now, why is it important to actually talk about this? Why is it important to actually draw the analogy between the casualties that we are losing to COVID-19 and the casualties and the victims that we lost to the Yom Kippur War? It is because at least in the initial months of the pandemic, the public statements of the Israeli government in terms of how we should look at this crisis as well as its management was couched in the vocabulary of warfare. And that was the message that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu kept emphasizing. That was certainly the message that even opposition politicians such as Naftali Bennett kept on emphasizing. This is a war. It's a war that we can win because we know how to fight. We fought before wars. We survived. That's it. And we will survive this one. That was the official line. And Israel wasn't the only country that adopted this militaristic attitude, if you will, or couching and understanding and preparing the population for COVID-19 as if it were another war. Some European countries did, but certainly we didn't see that everywhere. And it's interesting to note, I'm going to share the screen again for a moment. It's interesting to note that this attitude to the pandemic as another war that we have to fight actually resonated and found its reverberations in other countries. So, for example, early on in the pandemic, when Israel did exceedingly well, and I really want to bring back this very important chart or graphic which went viral at the time, and the date you see it was produced in the middle of April of 2020 by an organization called the Deep Knowledge Network Global, and they had a particular set of reports about COVID-19. And this chart went viral, and of course Israel was extremely proud of propagating this, because in April, so about a month into the pandemic, Israel was globally considered to be the safest country that was able to find a way to manage the fight against the virus, closely followed by Germany. And you see Switzerland at the time was only ranked the 11th, right here, the 11th safest country to be. So, of course, that's not where we are today. Israel today is far from being anywhere close to being the safest, either in the group of European comparators or globally. So things have changed. At this time, however, in April, when Israel is still looked at as the model state that the rest of the world should learn from, this is the time when Israel made news about some of the early advances made in Israeli laboratories about finding perhaps the beginning of a vaccine. This is the time when Israel is making global headlines about developing applications that help you track where to be or where not to be, where clusters of cases are found in particularly large density, which of course was very important for the public health sector in order to track the development of the disease and the virus. But I think it's instructive to look at this quote from Germany, from an artificial intelligence expert, who, of course, as you see from the quote, was very proud of her country's doing so well, being ranked as #2, while acknowledging that Israel is doing even better, which she found as not surprising when you consider that the country is in a permanent state of crisis and has a great deal of experience with border closures and states of emergency. So long as military preparedness seemed to be a solution, so long as that mindset was to be the way of handling and combating the crisis, designing policies accordingly, and expecting people, society, to be disciplined accordingly, Israel seemed to be doing well. But this really, COVID-19 is really unlike any of the wars that people were making these comparisons with. This is really more like a war of attrition. This is a long distance and the long-term engagement, which, if the country wants to win, it needs to be either disciplined or prepared for this long-term engagement. But for that, you need to make sure that that societal and political trust, that the series of 3 elections and the deep divisions that were introduced in the country exemplified and spoke about, would be corrected or would not be there. So let me conclude here the sort of the first part of the talk by just then summarizing that Israel's experience with COVID started out as Israel was a model country. Israel seemed to know what to do. Close the borders, shut down the airport, make sure that movement in and out, like many other European countries and countries elsewhere also followed suit, were done. And ask people to cooperate, ask people for their compliance in terms of social distancing, eventually with wearing the masks and so forth. And initially, all of that seemed to be working. You might remember how Prime Minister Netanyahu, who after the March 2020 election was busy trying to form and negotiate a new government, was busy fending off the legal challenges that to this day he has to be fighting for and he's entangled with. He was also organizing international video calls and video conferences, telling governments of other Western nations, Latin America also, but not just in Western Europe, what the Israeli way is of battling the pandemic and what he advises them to do. And the Austrian Chancellor gave him a very, very important public acknowledgement for the advice, as did the Hungarian Prime Minister, for being a source of such an important, strong advice. So this is how it started. Half a year later, by the time we get to the Hagim, by the time we are in November 2020, Israel doesn't, the story is very different. And so what I would like to do in the next third, so the second third of the talk, is to highlight and talk about some of the 2 main societal and political issues that I mentioned earlier, which certainly not arguing that they determined the outcome, but I think they help us see a little bit more of the context and appreciate how difficult, what a difficult moment the COVID-19 caught Israel at. So let's circle back to, and those of you who participated in that series of lectures that Adat organized in collaboration with the Azrieli Institute, when last year we looked at the development of the party system, we looked at the ups and downs, the dynamics of the long drawn-out Israeli election campaign. You might remember where we left all that discussion, saying that, okay, there was a national unity, national emergency government formed eventually in May 2020. Now, it's important to note that this government, the government that is now mandated to battle against the pandemic and also prepare the nation, prepare society for battling the pandemic, is a very large government that in the best of times is very, very difficult to pull together and get things done with. It's a large government with over 30 ministers, a government that's carefully orchestrated in terms of the division of the ministries on a parity basis between two groups of, between two camps. One camp being incumbent Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his party's Likud's close allies. This is Likud, United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi Ultra-Orthodox Party Alliance, Shas, the Sephardic Ultra-Orthodox Party, and Rabbi Rafi Peretz's Jewish Home that kind of broke away from the right-wing alliance, the modern Orthodox alliance to be part of the government. And on the other hand, so they control half of the government portfolios, the other half of the government portfolios, and the parity nature of this division is important. So both camps really have veto over what this government will actually agree to doing or not. The other, of course, is controlled by blue and white, led by the alternate prime minister in waiting, and the some, but certainly not all of the political parties that supported his campaign during the previous three elections. So those include the Labour Party, Gesher, but not all of them. Certainly, Yesh Atid is not part of that bloc. And here we need to also mention a small formation, by Tzvika Hauser and Joas Hendel, who broke away from the former defense minister Ya'alon's Telem party. So really, two camps controlling the government, each of them having, both of them having mutual veto on government decisions. It's very, very difficult to get things done. Now, this government, of course, is robust in the sense of having a large majority. So they do definitely, if there is internal agreement within this coalition on what needs to get done, what legislation to pass, they have enough seats in the Knesset in order to get things done. But many of the decisions that this large coalition government would need and needed to agree on actually became extremely divisive. So, for example, one of the most recent, or one of the more recent such flashpoints was the legislation that was passed imposing restrictions on how far individuals can leave their house in order to participate in public demonstrations, public rallies. And this, of course, situated in the context of incessant demonstrations against Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is really just but the continuation, but also the magnified continuation of the very strong anti-Netanyahu message that characterized an anti-Netanyahu campaigning that characterized the parties that challenged him in the elections of 2019 and 20. This week, we are now in the 22nd week of non-stop demonstrations against the Prime Minister. Started eventually in Balfour, near the Prime Minister's residence in Yerushalayim, but now it's really, really all over the country. And I see that, Sean, you're joining us from Israel, so maybe you can actually testify to this if you see the black flags near where you are, perhaps.
Yes,
also.
well, I saw them when I was driving back from a field trip last Thursday. And they're standing on the highways, but in Beersheba, we don't see too many people with black flags. It's not very popular in Beersheba to be anti-Netanyahu.
So it's definitely, thank you, Sean. So here we have
it's very localized.
Yeah. So it's clearly it's no longer just the Balfour. It's no longer just the Rehavia phenomenon. Okay. So on this particular piece of legislation, the coalition partners were extremely divided. In fact, one minister of the government, the Minister of Tourism, actually resigned over this issue, and a number of blue and white coalition members openly spoke and voted against the bill, which was supposed to be witnessing and supported in the Knesset with strong coalition majority. Similarly, today is Sunday. Just this past week, there was another controversial piece of legislation that the Knesset deliberated and eventually passed. This was a piece of legislation that you might have seen references to as the Tourist Islands Bill, which was to and designated Eilat as or exempting Eilat, if you will, from some of the COVID restrictions. And the whole argument and the kerfuffle was about offering or extending similar exemptions, similar treatments to other neighborhoods, to other townships and localities. But this was also extremely divisive. So really the Knesset has seen an awful lot of division, partly because, and infighting, partly because the government is really very divided, and the deep division between the two camps on many of these issues continues, and also because Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to attract a lot of resentment, which localized, although it is, as Sean mentioned, does carry a lot of public attention and does capture a lot of the headlines in the printed media, in the electronic media, and of course certainly also on television and so forth. Now, so the government has this problem. Within the government, there is a particular group of ministers that from early on were tasked with creating a set of policies and coordinating the government measures to fight COVID-19. And this is the Corona cabinet. Now, initially, the Corona cabinet consisted of 16 ministers, again, very carefully on a parity basis, dividing between sort of the left and the right and the left blocks within the coalition. But here too, the same divisions and the same paralysis that characterizes often the government at large also characterized the Corona committee. So eventually, in the summer, Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to let 6 members of the Corona cabinet go, so reduce the size of the Corona cabinet from 16 to 10. Still trying to preserve that parity, but in that shrinking, there were some very interesting and very symbolically, but also politically important losses or changes, if you will. For example, former Health Minister Yaakov Litzman no longer found a room and a spot in the reduced Corona committee, which contributed to severing and the deepening of the deteriorating relations between United Torah Judaism and the rest of the government. More about that in a moment. But in this shrinking, the Prime Minister also let all the female ministers go. So the new Corona cabinet now didn't have any female ministers sitting in it, which had very symbolic and which had another set of charges against the government. So, so the Corona cabinet, while it's a smaller body, it's really in no sense any more united than the larger government would be. What complicated matters further was the set of deep divisions within the Prime Minister's own political party. Now, throughout this period, after the government is formed in May 2020, you may remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu covertly and quietly initially, but more and more vocally eventually, prepares the country for a foreign policy breakthrough. First, there is a lot of talk about annexation of Yehuda and Shomron, or parts of the West Bank. And just as that gets removed off the table, we get the news in the late summer about normalizing Israel, normalizing with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, soon thereafter followed more recently with the Sudan. So the Prime Minister is clearly investing himself in running the country's foreign policy. Even though there is a foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, he really doesn't have much, if anything, to do with any of these developments. The country's chief diplomat continues to be the Prime Minister. When the normalization deals, the Abraham Accords are signed, you don't see Gabi Ashkenazi in the photos. It's not there. It's the Prime Minister together with President Trump and of course the representatives of the 2 Arab nations. It's a very different setup from the days when Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres paraded, if you will, together and then got the Nobel Prize also together for another peace treaty in the mid-1990s. Okay, so the Prime Minister is really investing and controlling and running foreign policy. While much of the burden of managing the COVID-19 really falls on 2 other senior ministers, both of them from Likud, the finance minister, Yisrael Katz, and former speaker of the Knesset, current health minister, Yuli Edelstein. And the 2 really don't see eye to eye on many issues. when the health minister calls for restrictions and measures that seem to be justified in terms of public health concerns, the finance minister is more concerned with the economic damage. And often these clashes become very, very public in the Knesset, in the caucuses, of course, and also on the pages of the newspapers. The deep divisions within Likud also manifested themselves in the tremendous confusion about once this position about the Corona Tsar, like the paramount public health expert, that office is created. And for the last several months, Professor Gamzu held that office until just very recently when it was eventually he stepped down. But there was really confusion about whom exactly the Corona Tsar, so Gamzu, should be reporting to, directly to the Prime Minister, to the Health Ministry, to the Health Minister. So a lot of confusion, clearly putting the brakes on any effective policy and its implementation that would be called for. As a friend recently noted in a conversation that I had, perhaps it seems that Israel has too many chiefs and not enough Indians in this particular context, and I thought that was a very cute and very smart way of summing it up. Let me just mention two anecdotes that I think will help us really contextualize this political malaise that the country is facing in this at this moment. The first is the almost unheard of scenario when the committee of the Knesset that's mandated to look after the various measures and checking on the government policies, exercising parliamentary oversight on the government in Corona pandemic matters. When the chairwoman of this committee, a member of the Likud party, a member of Knesset, Shasha Biton, openly and very publicly defied the party line, the line that her own party, Likud, asked her to represent and follow through in the committee, by disagreeing and casting her own vote as well against a particular government closure measure earlier on in the summer. Now, the image of the chairwoman chairing the meeting and the whip, so the person whose job it is to whip members of Likud and the coalition in order to make sure that they follow party discipline. Member of Knesset, Likud member of Knesset, Miki Zohar, is standing right next to him and shouting at next to her, shouting at her, "You're finished. You're finished. Your political life is over. You can't do this. I mean, the party tells you what to do. You can't go against it." Eventually, she survived the crisis, but Miki Zohar, in an unprecedented move, issued an insane number in one day, 12 disciplinary letters and measures to members of the Likud party. Some of these included ministers who tested the patience of the Likud leadership. So the party seemed to be in disarray, never really showing any signs that there would be an imminent rupture and breakup like Ariel Sharon did back in the days, but clearly it's a house with a lot of schism inside. And the same applies to the coalition. So lots of divisions about in the political leadership of the country. Now, let me turn briefly to two important societal issues that we need to talk about, because and those are the situations of the Israeli Arab and the Haredi communities. It is now common knowledge, although initially it was certainly the authorities treated it with great caution, how they would actually communicate this information to the public for fear lest it produces incitement against the two communities, that there is something grave going on amongst the Haredi and the Israeli Arab communities and sectors. The pandemic, the spread of the cases is much faster in these communities, and the morbidity rate is also much higher. According to a report that was prepared for the Gutman Center for Israeli Public Opinion, rather the Guttman Center reported on this public health report, the spread of the disease of the virus amongst the Israeli Haredim was 5 times as of September 2020. No, October 2020 was 5 times greater than amongst other Israeli Jews, so non-Haredi Jews. So a completely different situation. According to the most recent report, which I just read yesterday, the reproduction rate. So the reproduction rate of the virus is another key statistics that we have seen a lot in the news recently, is the number that tells us how many other people somebody infected with the virus is infecting. So if I'm obviously where you want to be in order to flatten that curve and eventually bring it down is for every infected person infecting less than one other person. If you keep infecting one, well, then there's not going to be a drop. Then it's going to be, then at least you're flattening out. But what you don't want to have in order to see that exponential increase in the spread of the virus is to have a reproduction rate of greater than 1. Well, amongst the Israeli, in the Haredi community, it has now exceeded 1. Slightly, but it has. And so it is an issue. In order to make sure that that in these communities and in the Haredi and the Arab communities, these matters are brought under control, the government initially by designating a part of course
Csaba, you're freezing slightly.
The joys of Zoom. Let's do this over here. Apologies, everybody. We are going to and we lost Csaba. I'm sure he's going to be back in a minute or two, everybody. Let's let him get back on. Jennifer, you can maybe send him a text or a WhatsApp. I feel like he knows that we lost him. I'm going to pause the recording for now.
Too much longer. Let's just very, very quickly to go back to the particular problems faced by the Haredi community, especially. Of course, lifestyle is a very important problem. Unlike the rest of Israeli Jewish society, the Haredim have far greater population densities where they live, far larger families, and social distancing is extremely difficult for them, therefore, to practice and exercise. Not impossible, but much more difficult. Moreover, in the Haredi world, in particular corners of the Haredi world, the advanced use of the kinds of social media and the kinds of communication devices that many of us take for granted, you can't. And that also makes the communication of some of the information, the transmission of some of the knowledge that would be important from the perspective of the government to get to these societal groups is also more difficult. So you have these issues. But also in the Haredi world, there have been very different attitudes on the part of the Haredi leadership towards the instructions and the expectations that are coming from the Israeli government. And it's very interesting to pay attention to the divide between the Ashkenazim and the non-Ashkenazim, and the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic. And here we are talking about primarily in the political world, the United Torah Judaism and the Shas attitudes, but not just, of course, they are only the political parties that represent them. In general, the Mizrahi community and the Sephardic community has been on block, much more cooperative with the government than the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, where you saw senior rabbinic leaders openly defying the government in the face of the government's decisions to close down or trying to close down yeshivot, trying to close down social gatherings that then the government tried to enforce through the use of police, which then led to tremendous altercations between the law enforcement agencies and the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox youth. Many of these, of course, the images of these went viral, further adding more fuel to the fire and further dividing, if you will, that community from the rest of society, which was already difficult given the data that I have mentioned, given the sense that people think about the ultra-Orthodox communities and the Arab communities as particular hotbeds of the COVID-19 virus, spreading at greater numbers than elsewhere. So a very, very tricky and delicate balance. So lack of a united common front and common response from these sectors has also been an issue. Now, to wrap things up in terms of where the country is going, there is something fascinating to consider. And here I'm going to show you one slide, or maybe two slides, which I think tell us something really unexpected. And it's an eye-opening. Stu, I think I have to ask you to allow me to share the screen, please. Or Jennifer, I think, yeah, okay, great, thanks very much. So the slide that I would like to share is this is the first one. These are the anti-Bibi protests and images that the country has been seeing on the various media for several months now. So we have a pandemic, just claiming more and more lives. We have very strong, very visible public demonstrations against the government, but specifically against its leader, Prime Minister Netanyahu. We have a government that is really not doing a terrific job in terms of getting out a united, coordinated set of policies and measures to the society. So in this context, let's ask the question, if elections were held today, who would win? Because this is what political parties are ultimately calculating and looking at. So this is the timeline of the expected seat shares that, according to public opinion polls that we have the results of here, going back to June 2020 all the way to really last week, November 2020. Look at this line. Likud, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, has never stopped being the largest party with the expected highest number of seats emerging from an election, if one were held on any day during this period. Even today, like, yes, Likud would be weakened. It would probably win a few, according to the public opinion polls, fewer seats than what it has now in the Knesset, but head and shoulders above the other parties that you would expect to do better. The second largest party, this party here, is the current opposition, Yamina. Look where they are currently, I mean, the line doesn't show it, but currently they only have 5 seats in the Knesset. In June, they were expected to have already more than 10, and just under 10, and look where they are now. This is the political party led by Naftali Bennett, who has, and really, kol hakavod lo, he has spared no effort trying to warn the people of the importance of following government instructions, but also healing the division between the Haredi and the non-Haredi Jewish worlds in Israel. He went on record a few weeks ago telling the government, look, you can't expect the Haredi not to study Torah together and not to go to yeshivot and not to learn. It's like you not breathing oxygen. It is their life. So you really don't have this kind of a voice coming from Likud, not certainly so eloquently and so explicitly. But this is not the only thing that Bennett obviously has been doing, which pays seemingly and handsomely in terms of his following. Another point I would like to add, that if you look at the combined vote total of Likud Yamina, which is Naftali Bennett's party, as well as Shas and UTJ, they are a little bit further down. The combined vote total of this regrouped right religious coalition is a majority. And we see this now for over several weeks. If elections were held today, Likud, together with Yamina and the ultra-Orthodox party, so a Likud plus religious parties coalition, would be able to win and form a majority government in the Knesset. Now, in the meantime, that blue and white coalition that challenged Netanyahu at the polls in the last elections, that's long broken up and divided, and their different fragments are nowhere near any shape to give Netanyahu a strong challenge in the polls. So who stands to benefit from it? It seems that the way the prime minister and the right-wing parties have been managing even this very difficult political and social problem, it seems that they actually are charting a course that may very well bring them back to power if elections were held today. Will elections be held today? Well, or tomorrow? No. But are we going to see perhaps that automatic election trigger on December or before December 13th? That is becoming increasingly more likely, especially in the light of the American elections. In the light of the American elections, we already see in the public opinions that Israelis are becoming more conservative. Prior to the American elections, the last reports that I saw, which were presented by the Mitvim Institute, it's an Israeli Foreign Policy Index Institute, and they presented the results of a survey about what Israelis would like to see as an outcome in the US elections. And 50% of the respondents said Trump, and a significantly smaller percentage said Biden, and some were lukewarm or non-committed. As a Trump victory is becoming less and less, well, the Trump victory didn't happen as expected by those who expected a Trump victory, and we don't know yet where things might unfold. But where we are today, where America is today, clearly doesn't suggest the same kind of easy, cozy relationship between the Israeli and the American government that transformed the map of regional alliances in the Middle East. In a way, and to the extent that Israel can call two Gulf states, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, as her partners, friends, and allies. So preparing for a democratic administration, we do see already in the polls indications that Israeli voters are becoming more conservative. And even throughout the pandemic, while Prime Minister Netanyahu lost a lot of political and social trust and support for not handling the crisis as well as he could, he never lost on two fronts. A, being the best foreign policy leader for the country. He consistently has, even his critics gave him a very good report card. And two, he never lost that very important position of the leader most fit to be prime minister. Not Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, close, but not quite there. So the cards are stacked fairly well in the prime minister's favor if elections were to be triggered at the end of December. I'm going to stop here. I spoke a lot longer than I promised to Stu that I would. I do want to thank you for your indulgence and not checking out when my Zoom crashed. And so let me stop here and just see if there are any questions. You can't throw tomatoes and eggs at me because we actually are not in the same room. But if you have any questions, I will try to answer them.
My question is, could you address the Arab situation as far as the COVID goes? You said Haredi, but where do the Arabs fit in?
Yeah, Carol, yes. I think, Carol, thank you very much. So problem is the same. The reproduction rate of COVID is a little bit less than in the Haredi sectors. In the Haredi sector, we saw the last report was 1.02. In the Israeli Arab sector, it's just under 1, but it is higher than in the rest of Israel. So among the Israeli Jewish sector. In the case of the Arab communities, structurally the problems are the same, and that is high population density and lack of social distancing. There, the issue is less with religious learning institutions such as the yeshivot, but rather large communal and family gatherings. And we have seen a lot of problems and police enforcement needing to be applied in order to curtail and large Arab weddings, which bring the large Arab families, often from nearby cities and towns, together. So, like many Haredi neighborhoods and towns, similarly, many Arab towns were classified as red areas according to that traffic light situation. Now, if the designation of the Haredi sector is politically touchy, well, the same applies even more so for the Israeli Arab sector, especially in a context when the country is battling COVID-19, but at the same time is celebrating 3 new peace deals, right? This is fantastic. I mean, since the 1970s, since the 1990s, we haven't seen anything like that. Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, there were talks about Oman, Morocco possibly being added. When it comes to the Knesset vote, when the UAE, the peace agreement and the peace agreement with Bahrain are voted on in the Knesset, the Arab parties vote against it. So this, in the context of the same difficult social problems that COVID already creates, makes it that political keg, if you will, powder keg, is very risky for politicians to touch. So what is happening, Carol, is that you see quite a bit more discussion of the Haredi issue, both in the Knesset committees and plenary and in the media, than about the Arab issue. You do see, but quite a bit less. So for example, I don't know, some of you might have caught this debate, it was now about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, when Haredi owned store in the city of Arad was torched. And so this really created a very difficult soul searching again and debate in the Knesset. So we don't really see quite the same interaction and dynamic between Jews and Arabs. So it seems to be that when it comes to the Haredim, that division and that societal anger expresses itself quite a bit differently than against the Arabs. But it's a difficult political situation, but structurally the problems are the same. So structurally, the Israeli, COVID-wise, the Israeli Arab sector and the Israeli Haredi sector are really in the same challenge. But the political management of the two call for different approaches, very different approaches.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't look at the chat. I do apologize.
We had a question. Shlomo.
What happens to the research in the vaccine that is in Zion? At what stage is it? And the other question is, if Bennett wants to reconcile between the religious and the secular groups in Israel, if he creates a coalition with Shas and the others, I don't believe he will be able to succeed in it. So what is his option?
For Bennett, for Naftali Bennett?
For Bennett, yes, to be able to create a coalition that will bring everybody together.
Well, he would not. Well, so Bennett is dancing a very delicate game. On the one hand, you're absolutely right that he is the last one to blame the Haredim, and he is the first one to make sure that the religious bloc is cohesive and united. And remember, the religious bloc stood by Netanyahu throughout those 3 elections. Like after April 2019, we had months of government formation attempts which failed. And then came September 2019, followed by months of government formation attempts that failed. And then came March 2020, followed by 2 months of government formation attempts, and they succeeded. Shas, United Torah Judaism, and Yamina and Jewish Home, so the religious, the ultra and the modern Orthodox religious parties stood by Netanyahu and Likud consistently. The only one that is now out of government and in the opposition, that's Bennett. So really, he wasn't really dealt quite so fairly, largely because given his age, given his charisma, given his accomplishments on the political right in Israel, it's between him and less so today, it seems. About a year ago, his colleague Ayelet Shaked was also touted as a potential future leader. But Bennett today is very widely talked about as a very likely future leader of the Israeli political right. So he has never walked away from his commitment to that Likud plus the religious parties bloc and that idea. That's his natural political constituency and coalition to support and to build. Having said that, he is also a smart politician. And he recognized the great gains that Avigdor Lieberman, or the great pains and damage that Avigdor Lieberman was able to impose on the Prime Minister Netanyahu when he started moving away from the right and closer to the center. So when the Knesset session opened about a month ago, it usually opens with several votes of no confidence against the government. These are really symbolic for technical reasons. It made big headlines in Israel that Bennett and Yamina voted with the opposition, vote of no confidence against the government. Now, Likud made a big deal out of it. You say the right wing cannot trust Bennett. We need to replace them with someone. But that really was just cheap political talk because Bennett is in the opposition and they have really been playing just the part of the opposition. They oppose the government, but on key issues, they of course stand by it because where the right wing is at stake in terms of its vitality, that's really Bennett's natural constituency. So he's very much together with the Haredim, and the Haredi leadership actually reciprocates that. He gets very good coverage. Bibi Netanyahu doesn't get quite the same coverage anymore in the Haredi media. There you see now articles and discussions about the Likud Haredi alliance perhaps reaching or entering a qualitatively different stage and state, less of a cozy one than it may have been before. That's not the reputation and that's not the reputation of Bennett, and that's not the discussion that he gets in the Haredi world. In terms of the vaccine, well, it seemed that, so initially in the early summer, we heard, and there were very important reports that there was a research laboratory and institute in the Galil that was in the front lines of developing the vaccine. That seemed to peter out, and Israel is now lining up and in fact secured the deal to obtain I think 8 million vaccines from Pfizer. Yeah. So initially Israel wanted to procure this from a competing from another pharmaceutical company, but it really does seem to be that Pfizer is going to be the one rolling out the vaccine that the rest of the world is probably going to be using. And so so that's it's not indigenous, but it's there. So the vaccine is happening.
Hi, Sheila.
Okay.
Anita.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have one or two.
Oh, I didn't see your.
Sorry, yeah, I have one or two questions. Okay.
Please,
yeah, hi.
please yourself. Yeah, but you didn't say. Yeah, I'm listening. I can hear you very well.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so yes, I actually have two questions. One of which I already wrote down in the chat. So where do they call it in everyday conversation? Corona, such as in Israel, and where in the world do they call it? COVID in everyday conversation like in North America? So that's my first question.
So the question is why?
No. Well, the question just is, like where in the world, which countries do they call it Corona in everyday conversation, and which countries do they call it COVID more like?
This is very interesting. So the countries that I'm paying more attention to in this about the pandemic, Joseph, are really the countries of the European Union, and it's really interchangeable. So, for example, in Germany, England, and in the Swiss case, you see references to COVID-19 and Corona really about the same frequency, in the same headlines, the same research reports, in the same articles. So I really can't say with a straight face that I can tell you that I'm aware of or see a pattern in terms of how it would be called where. So I know that's not a good answer, but that's the answer that it's the non-answer that I can give.
Yeah.
So I really have, it's really just interchangeable. I really haven't seen, yeah, please.
And not even in Israel so much.
No, you really do. In Israel, you really do see Corona more. Now, if I were to think back of how often I would see COVID-19, it's definitely much less frequent.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And second little question is there much more of a frequency of Corona among Muslim Arabs in Israel versus among Christian Arabs who are more westernized and more affluent, etc.?
Yes, so that's an issue. So clearly, it's less. The issue doesn't seem to be as much to do with whether with the religious outlook, but it seems to have more with socioeconomic class. So Israeli Arabs, be they Muslim or Christian, although there is an overlap. There is an overlap in terms of affluence and whether they are Christian or Muslim, but there you see the same breakdown that you have those who are wealthier, those who are more middle class, have smaller families, have better jobs, more white-collar jobs. They are able to stay at home. They are able to stay at home. They are able to extricate themselves from the kind of density of social life that seems to be providing this hotbed for the proliferation of the virus. But look, if you look at, for example, the Arab city of Nazareth has also great problems. So, and there, of course, Arab Christianity is very, very much dominant. So, so I see this an issue more of class rather than religion per se. But thank you, Yosef. I didn't see your question in the chat, so I'm sorry. Maybe I lost it when.
Csaba, it happened when you got cut off.
Csaba, I have a question. Lazar is here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh,
thank you.
So I thought several months ago, someone had suggested that the army take over the management of COVID-19, and that way you would avoid this internal fractiousness and so on. What happened to that?
Well, it never happened.
That's right.
No. So it never happened, and it's a very interesting thing. And I think that whole notion of having too many chiefs and not enough Indians very much captures this. If the IDF had assumed responsibility for it, and if it had done a thorough and excellent job at it, who would have gained the credit? It wouldn't have been the finance minister, it wouldn't have been the health minister, and it wouldn't have been the prime minister. It would have been the minister of defense. So, and that is, of course, Benny Gantz. So it's possible that the army would have been capable, although that is questionable. But there was a very important political consideration in terms of where the credit of that particular arrangement, if it succeeds, would go. But B, while Israel has been at peace and regional affairs have been mostly peaceful for the last several months, we are not sure today just quite how much we can take this peace for granted. There is more and more talk of some military engagement possibly coming in the last days of the Trump, or last months of the Trump administration. That's certainly something that you see more and more reports about. So the IDF also has other, and I shouldn't say better, but other important military things to do. The IDF, of course, is an incredible organization and state within the state. But when it's used for non-military purposes, that also, it can work very well. Here, if that had been the case, of course, the allocation of the political credit would have been an issue. But if it doesn't work well, then of course it's a misuse of resources. But that idea, it really dropped off the agenda. My understanding of why that happened, Lazar, is really more about the political situation within the government. That just really would have strengthened it would have strengthened the constituency and the political clout of the alternate prime minister in waiting, and that's of course Prime Minister Netanyahu would have been crazy to do.
Thank you, Csaba.
That's politically, that's not the political logic of the government.
Yeah, very informative. Thank you for your talk today.
Thank you, Lazar.
And best of luck to your wife on her book.
Thank you so much.
So Csaba, with all of that, I want to say thank you so much. Ellie, say bye, everybody. Say thank you, Csaba.
Thank you, Csaba.
Say see you soon. Okay. And we'll see you guys all soon, very, very soon for everything. Csaba, as always, this was amazing.
Thank you, Stu. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining in.
Thank you, Csaba.
Stay healthy.
Thank you. Technical difficulties we might have had.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Csaba.
תודה, תודה.